In this video, we're going to create a Fusion 360 script that can read a user parameter and also create one. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in the last video in this series, we took a look at a basic overview of Python, and specifically on Python for object-oriented programming. Now again, it was by no means a complete introduction to Python, and again, I am not a programmer, but I do think it's important that at least we started with the basics. Let's do a quick review just in case this is the first one you're tuning into. So we did a basic example where we created some variables. We stored strings and numbers in those variables, and we learned how to print them out and also to convert, for example, the number to a string so that way we could concatenate them in the same statement. We also took a look at the basics of object-oriented programming and the fact that they have a hierarchy. Now this will make more sense when we start programming our Fusion 360 script, but the basic understanding of the fact that there's ownership or permission between different objects is an important concept. Then we did a basic example of creating a class, in this case, Learn Everything About Design class. We defined the init as self, first, and second, which was in this case, the variable that we created, dot first and variable dot second. This was basically a way for us to pass information into this new class. So we created an API series that was part of the lead class. And these are individual instances in that class. And we passed into it intro to API as a first argument or the first parameter. And then we passed return a user param as the second. We did the same thing for another variable, form series. And again, we passed in 2 arguments. Then we learned that we could put them together in our print statement. Now in Fusion 360, what we want to do is we want to talk about creating a script and really understand where some of those basics come into play. One thing we didn't get into is that the functions that we create are also called methods. Those can be regular, based on the class, or based on static. Now, in Fusion 360, the vast majority of these methods or functions are based on the class, while there's some exceptions that are static. This will hopefully make a little bit more sense, but just note that it is an important consideration to understand that methods or functions can be class-based or static-based. And for right now, that should be as far as we take that. So in this example, the first thing that I want to do is I want to go to my modify and change parameters, and I want to create a new user parameter. We're going to call this length, and we're going to have a capital L. And then we just need to set it to an expression. I'm going to say 500. So note inside of this dialog box, we have name, unit, expression, the value, which is expression, is based on the numerical input, but if you're also relating it to some mathematical operator, for example, divided by 2, then it'll evaluate that and it'll give you what the number is. And then the comment here, which you can leave blank. So now we have a user parameter called length, and it's 500 millimeters. So from here, we want to go into utilities and scripts, and we want to create a new script. So we're going to select create, I'm going to choose Python, and I want to name this new script. And since we're going to get a user parameter, I'm going to start with API, so it's at the top of my list, and then I'm going to say get UP for user parameter. We'll say create, and then I'm going to select edit. This is going to open up, and I'm going to first say, yes, I trust the author. And again, because we're creating these, we're going to automatically trust the author, but in some cases you do need to be careful. If you're just downloading code off the internet, then you want to make sure that you do trust the author. So every time we create a new script in Fusion 360, it's going to give us this sort of core text. There are a couple things that we want to make sure we identify in here. First, we have import. Now at the very top, we have these modules, and these modules are going to bring in core functionality. So we have Autodesk Core, Autodesk Fusion, Autodesk CAM, because we have access to the CAM workspace, and then we have this traceback. Next, you see that we have this def, run, and context, UI none, and then try and accept. For the purposes of what we're doing, we're going to focus our attention in the area of try, and basically you can think about this as this is the code it's going to try to run, And then if there's an exception, then here is the failed message that we're going to get. So when we run this default script that we get every time we create a new script, we are automatically creating a variable called app. And this is similar to the variables we created for things like input length. And this is going to be equal to Autodesk core. Now these are both the modules. Application, which is the class. So this is similar to the class we created, lead. And then it's .get, which is the method. This is a class-based method. And then it leaves it open. So basically what's happening here is we're accessing the object to define Fusion 360, to define the entire application. Next, we're setting a new variable, UI, and the new variable is equal to app, which was this entire thing up here, app.userInterface. So this sort of access to these objects is going to be the way in which we progress through creating a script. We're going to do the exact same thing. And the next thing that happens here is UI, which is our variable, dot message box, and then it's passing along this, in this case, it's a string, hello script. So the message box here is the method, and UI is our variable. Now remember that variable now inherits anything from this app, which is the entire program here, and this user interface property. So this is the methodology that we're going to go through. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this UI message box. I'm just going to delete everything that's in it for right now, and I'm going to push it down a few lines. So we're going to hit enter. As we look through code in Python, and specifically in Fusion 360 API Python, we will note that there are indents that happen, tabs that happen, and the way that it keeps track of things in this try section is by these indents. So you can see here that the except has an if statement, and the if statement has a tabbed in variable in this case. So again, ownership or sort of inclusion into that little loop area or whatever we're trying to create is based on these tabs or these indents. So you'll notice that if I space this in, that I'm getting all sorts of errors. There's problems because it does not fit the format that it wants. It must have this format. Unlike using other programming languages, or if you've used Arduino code where you have brackets for the start and the end, that doesn't really work here. We have to be mindful of the formatting. And again, this is another reason why we use something like, in this case, Visual Studio Code, because it takes care of all this formatting for us and the checking. Okay, so now that we have our our app.userInterface set to UI, the next thing that we need to do is we actually need to get the active design. So in our case, we're going to create a new variable called design, and we're going to set that equal to, in this case, we're going to do ADSK, so Autodesk.Fusion. All right, so we're setting it equal to Fusion, and then we're doing a what's called a cast. And casting is basically a way for us to sort of convert some of these objects. So there's an object level variance that we need to understand, but for the purposes of our example, we're just going to note that cast is going to be important for us. So we're going to do cast, and then in brackets, we're going to do app, so that app, which was our Autodesk core application, and we're going to do dot active product. And you'll notice that a lot of things already pop up for us, things active document, active edit object, active product, and so on. So one of the reasons that we want to be very mindful of how we access things is because we want the active product, because we're going to be talking about user parameters, and those are at the product level. When we're talking about things like the current object or component that's being edited, we might choose to use things like active edit object. But for this one, we're going to do active product. And you'll note that, as I mentioned before in our previous example, design has not been used at all. So it's not accessed. So it's showing up as gray, whereas the other ones are white because they have been used. So now we have this design, Autodesk Fusion.cast app active product. So there's one piece that I'm missing in here, and I can tell that I'm missing it because of the way that this is colored. So one thing we did not access was the design. Now, if you remember when we were talking about the actual object model, We've got the application, we've got the user interface, and then we didn't access this design. So this design A right here. So we're missing that piece of the puzzle. And this is important because if we don't have that piece of the puzzle, then none of this stuff is going to work. So we're going to say design dot, and now you can see that cast has turned green. So this method or this argument comes from the class design, and we were missing that class before. We grabbed the modules up here, the Autodesk Fusion, so that module gave us access to something else. So up here we have Autodesk Core and then the actual class's application. So without that class, we're missing all of that functionality that we need in order to progress down the chain. So again, these are important little pieces of the puzzle that we want to make sure that we kind of keep an eye on as we're going through our coding. The next piece of the puzzle that we need to think about is what it actually means to call a function or a method. So in a lot of cases, when you're looking for a function or a method, what ends up happening is you're getting a return. It's returning a value. And you can see in this case, the method is returning design. So when we start to call other functions, what we end up getting is a return value that we might need to use somewhere else. So the thing that we need to use in this case is something called userParameters and itemByName, because we're looking for a very specific user parameter called length. So I'm going to create a new variable and I'm going to call it RET for return, and then capital PARAM, return param. It's just a little bit of a shorthand because I don't want to type out the whole thing. And we're going to set that equal to, and this is design. Now remember, design was this variable we created up here. And now that we're using it, it's coming in, it's changing from gray to white. And you can see that it's in here. And again, it's important that we note the object or the little icon next to it. So design dot, and this is going to give me access to everything I need from the active product design class. So what we're going to do is we're going to start typing user, and you can see we have user parameters, unit manager, and Fusion Units Manager. So we will get to Units Manager because this is going to be an important piece of the puzzle for what we're doing. But for right now, what we're doing is we're using user parameters. The next thing that we need is something called itemByName. So I'm going to hit period, and then you'll notice again that we have a lot of things that we can do here. Add is what we're going to use to add or create a new user parameter. And you can see that purple box icon. And as we go down the list, you can see here item and itemByName. And as we go down, you can see that there are a whole lot of different things we can do. When we see these double underscores, I think the sort of the terminology that's commonly used is called dunder, double under, dunder. But you can see that some of them, as we get down here, have sort of these double unders. And I believe that these are inherited from Python, while these ones up here, itemByName, item, these are specific to the Fusion API. So we're going to do itemByName. And then with itemByName, just like with all of the other functions that we're using, we need to put these brackets in. And once we put our cursor in these brackets, we should be able to get some information about what we need. So once I start the bracket, it automatically finishes it and it says we're looking for a name, and that name is a string. So this is going to return the specified user's parameter using the name of the parameter as it was displayed. So what we're going to do here is we're looking specifically for the name length. So again, I'm going to just type it in and we're going to be case sensitive, and then we're going to hit enter. Now we haven't used return parameter yet, but we want to use it in a message box. And we can see here we've got UI message box. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to use that. So I'm going to bring it up a couple lines and go ahead and just pop the information I need in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in RET PARAM, the return parameter. But there's a little bit more here. Now, as we already looked at, user parameters have the name, they have the expression, they have their units, they have a comment. There are all these different pieces of information that are associated with them. So when we actually call that itemByName and we look for length, all of that data is put back into this variable return parameter. So what we want to do is we want to access some of that data. And the way that we do it is we put a period, And then we can take a look at the different elements or attributes that are associated with it. Now, in this case, you'll notice that we're getting wrench icons. So there are attributes, there's comment, there is design, there's entity token, and not all of these are going to be applicable to what we're doing. But in this case, we want to take a look at what the expression is. So we're looking for that return parameter dot expression. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back into Fusion, and then we're going to run this. And after we run this, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a little bit more about how to find these different pieces. So we're going to say run, and you can see we get this dialog box and it says 500 millimeters. So it gives us back exactly what we put into this modify, change parameters, and user parameter, 500 millimeters. What if we change this? What if we make this 50 millimeters? Let's go ahead and go back to our utilities, back to the add-ins, we'll rerun that script, and now it says 50 millimeters. So we know that functionally it is working. But how did we arrive at that? So if we go back to our code, I sort of walked you through the process of setting up design and setting up item by name and setting up this return parameter dot expression. But how would you actually be able to figure that out on your own? Well, to do that, we're going to take a look at the help file that's associated with Fusion API. So in the Fusion help file, under the programming interface, we have getting started with Fusion's API. And it gives you basic concepts. It talks about objects, which we mentioned. And again, you can see the example is extrude feature. And then they give you access to this PDF, this chart where you can take a look at the object models. And on the left-hand side, we can take a look at what's new. We can take a look at the user manual. But really what we're focused on is going to be this API reference manual. So when we look at this reference manual, we have objects inside of it, and below it, we've got these sample programs. So oftentimes a good place to start is to find a sample program that does what you're trying to do or relatively close. So for me, it would be probably under modeling, maybe under general, and we can look through here and we can see if there's one that creates, creates the variables we're looking. It's not in there, so I'll go to general, parameters, set parameters from CSV file, and export to step. When I open this up, you can see that I've got Python and C++ code, so you can kind of see a difference between the two. And when we look through the code, you can see that it has some comments. It reads a CSV file, it brings that in, and then it parses it out. It sets the parameters, and then it exports the step file of the design. So it does a few extra things that we don't need, but the important bit is right here in the middle where it sets the parameters. Now, this isn't necessarily exactly how it has to happen, but you can see that it gives us a bit of information. Length param that they created is design.userParameters.itemByName, and this is the name that they're doing. Then the length param expression is equal to length, and this length value comes from their CSV file. So while it doesn't have everything we need, it did give us a little bit more information. We need access to user parameters, and they're using design.userParameters. And if we look up here, design is the active product that they're using. So it gives us a sort of a pointer to figure out where we need to go. So I want user parameters and item by name. And rather than searching through everything, we could just search at the very top because there are a lot of objects. But if we scroll down, we can find the user parameters. And you can see here we've got user interface, user parameter, and user parameters. Now the key here is in their example, it's parameters. So I'm going to grab this one and I'm just going to take a look at the help file. So it's derived from a base object, so it gives you information here. It tells you a little bit about what it does. It's defined in the adsk.fusion. So remember at the header we have adsk.core.fusion and we have the .cam. So it has information about its namespace or where it's inheriting from. It's derived from a base object. If it came specifically from something else, it would tell you there. And then we have these methods and these properties. And inside of the methods, we have add, which tells us that we can use it to create a new collection, in this case, a user parameter. We have class type, item, which returns the specified parameter using an index into the collection. What that means is the first the first user parameter would be index number 0, because it'll start at 0, and then 1 and 2. Or we can find the item by its name. And this is usually a better option if you know what the name is. So those are the methods that we can use, those functions that we can use to do things. The one we're interested in is adding and item by name. Then we also have some properties below here. You can see that we've got like returns the number of parameters in the collection. It has returns the design that owns it. So if there are multiple components or something like that, is valid, and object type. And then you can see here it actually points us to the sample. Now another thing we have here is accessed from, and it shows design.userParameters, and then it has userParameter.userParameters. So we can click on these, and then it'll give us to a little bit of sample code that shows you a little bit how it's done in C++ and Python, and then it brings you to the property values. If we go back and we want more information on, let's say, add, then it dives down a little bit deeper. And then inside of here, add tells us that we need 4 different things. Now we're going to come back to this when we get to the add part, but this value input is a critical step. So while it's not perfectly clear at this stage, it does point you in slightly the right direction. And a lot of times those sample programs will often have additional functionality than you want. So it does take a little bit of playing. For me, the way that I like to do this is to do this in small chunks. So to make sure that I can actually access a user parameter, I would create one in a file, and then I would figure out how I can gather information about it. So let's say instead of expression, let's say that we wanted to grab something else. So this time I'm going to say dot, and let's grab the comment. I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to Fusion 360. Now, we didn't actually put a comment in, so I need to modify it. So inside of here, we can add a comment. We'll just say, check this out. We'll say, OK. We'll go to our utilities, our add-ins, and we'll run that same script again. And you can see it passes that string back to us. Check this out. So with that code, we know that we're on the right track. We know that we can access the user parameters, and we can return some value, a comment, an expression, whatever the case might be. So that tells me that this design.userParameters is the little bit of code that I need. So that I know that was a lot of work to get to this stage, but this is honestly probably the hardest part, is starting to learn these fundamentals of how to access these little bits of information. Now this is a good one because it's just one piece of information we're pulling. We're pulling the information directly from a user parameter that we created. So I think that's a great place for us to stop this because we're already over 20 minutes. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to create our own user parameter. So now that we have this foundation or this basis laid, we'll be able to do that a little bit easier. So from here, I think it's a good idea for you just to browse through the help file, take a look at things like the sort of object hierarchy, see if you can find bits and pieces that you're looking for, or maybe search through the help file and see if there's a property or a method that you want to use for something, and try to backtrack, figure out how you can get access to it. And you can always come in and you can start, for example, design equals Autodesk Fusion design. And from there, what you could do is you could just sort of backtrack to see what you can access. And what I mean by that is, for example, user interface is set to app.userinterface. So if I type UI dot, then I can see all kinds of things: active command, active selections, active workspace, and so on. So what we could do is we could get the information about the active workspace, and that property, which is based on that little wrench icon, will return the value of the active workspace. So for example, if we set this to active WS for workspace and we set it equal to UI.activeWorkspace, we could do a UI.messageBox and we could return our active WS, our active workspace. Now theoretically, what this means is that when we run this, it's going to return us a value that tells us what active workspace we're in. Let's give it a shot. You can see here that we get an error message. Now, these are going to be a little bit tough for us to get through at this point, but you can tell that the line 12, run UI message box, active WS, this is where the problem lies. And then it tells us the type error, wrong number or type of arguments or overloaded function. So in order for us to figure that out, we need to do a little bit more digging. And the way that we do a little bit more digging is to go back to this active workspace property. And remember that when we want to return something, that we really need to have these brackets. So when I start to put the brackets in and we save it, now there is a place for those objects to be. Let's go ahead and give this one more shot. Add-ins, we'll do the API get up, run, and you can see now we get a different error message. So now it's telling me that the workspace object is not callable. So at this stage, if you couldn't get what you needed out of it, then what we would do is we would find this UI.activeWorkspace in our help file. And we do that by coming in here and looking through the objects. We'll go back up to A, and we'll find active workspace. So when we find active, you see here active workspace is not listed. So if it's not listed, then we'll go to our search and we'll look for active, actually it's going to be one word, so active workspace. And here we go, user interface active workspace property. So you can see the property value is returned here, the user interface variable, which in our case is UI.active workspace, and they don't have any brackets here. But here it says this is a read-only property whose value is a workspace. So we click on workspace, we can see here that the workspace provides access to a set of panels. It comes from the core base object. And when we look through here, it'll give you information about ID information and so on. So unique ID of the workspace, and if we click on this, we can see here that it gives us a sample. Now when we go to the sample and we look for somewhere in the code where it's using this workspace, the active workspace, we can just look for it in the code. There's core.workspaces, and then they use UI item. So they're calling the workspace first and not UI. So we're just sort of missing that little piece of the puzzle in order to sort of figure it out. I don't think at this point it's going to be beneficial for us to keep going down this rabbit hole, but what we could do is we could try to do UI.workspace activated. You can see that we've got different ones here, and then we've got workspaces, and then we can go dot, and we can see if we can find the information about it. So item ID is valid, or we can just kind of go through here and figure out what we have available to us. Now, if workspaces isn't the right option, then we can go through and we can see what other things we have here. So the wrenches, again, these are properties. The purple thing here is going to be a function, which means that we need to add more information. So this gives us, you can see here, a workspace list. It will return all of them associated with the specific product, and again, so on. So it's getting a little bit outside of the intent of this, and this is typically what happens. You look for something and then you spend a bunch of time debugging it. Sometimes it's easier than others. If that's important, then we can try to work through that. But for right now, I don't want to get too far from our initial goal. So our initial goal here is to return the parameter and display comment, expression, the value, whatever, back to the user. And I think we've done that. So let's make sure we save. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And what we're going to do in the next one, again, is we're going to create our own user parameter. So that's the next step in this process. So as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.